visibility of their physical world. Keeping people and machines on time and on budget is a difficult task. This is why drones are becoming adopted to provide real-time visibility. But today, decision-making is still manual and requires input from humans.
Okay, here we go. So why don't we start with my ride to the Web Summit this morning. I got in a really interesting conversation with my Uber driver who was explaining that they went on strike yesterday for 4 hours. And I didn't even know Uber could go on strike. I was like, it's not like you're unionized. But he basically said that we want to make a statement that the government doesn't recognize us. And we've been, for 4 years trying to get recognized by our government. And this is a big fight. I've been fined as much as 15,000 euros when I get stopped by the police. So this is just one small example, but symptomatic of a bigger question, which is, how easy does government make it for companies and cities to get cars off the road and facilitate transport? Why don't we start with you, Sharon, and then get a quick glimpse from our other panelists?
Sure. Thanks, Jackie. I think it's becoming increasingly more easy because governments are realizing that it's very, very important to look at what's actually happening in the tech sector and what's coming ahead of time and how we can use that to actually reach our policy goals. So policy goals of CO2 reduction, for example, and policy goals of delivering more equity in transport to the citizens. If we look at what's happening, I think Finland is a good example of a government that has very, very recently brought in a transport code, and the idea of the transport code has been to give a level playing field to all of the actors in the transport industry so as to allow new innovation to foster, so that we can look and have very, very quickly new things on the market, not just from innovation, but bring them to the markets as quickly as possible so that they can deliver in terms of bringing citizens what they really need.
Great. Vasco, what's your 2-cent view on governments?
Well, I think that we are living through a technological revolution where innovation goes much faster than regulation. And this provokes reactions from the incumbents, from the people that have the need for those type of services. And I think that the example you have just mentioned is a clear sign of that. So what we have been doing at Brisa, realizing the change in behavior, in the need of the clients, was to have transforming our vision from being a pure infrastructure player into a mobility player. And this means going from the car to the people. This has another impact, which was our mission became to provide efficient mobility to the people. And what we are focusing is on the right mix, finding the right mix of providing the integration of our network to the ecosystem, to the mobility ecosystem that has to be linked, that has to be connected, and has to have the free choice for the people. So answering what you were asking, I think that the regulation is not following as fast as the innovation that we are seeing and the people are demanding.
Okay, got it. So, Nicolas, you make a living off of connecting people, unlike Uber. I mean, you're basically a professional carpooling service. You're in 22 countries. Can you talk a little bit briefly about the kind of regulatory static, in spite of that model, that you're running up against today?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the first thing to mention when you're going back to your first question is the transport landscape has changed radically in the last 5-10 years. right? I mean, 5, 10 years ago, you had no BlaBlaCar, no Uber. I mean, the world was pretty simple or pretty static in terms of transport, and things have been completely transformed by mobile phones, by communities, what we do, by Uber, and so on and so on. And it's true that regulators have been very much on the back foot so far, and they were trying to adapt and understand, like, okay, what's going on? What is this thing called Uber? What is this thing called BlaBlaCar? I think what's still lacking today is maybe some level of political will at the European level, at country and member state level, to say, okay, here's what we want to see for the transport of the future, whether it's short distance or long distance. So today, I feel regulators are trying to help, but a bit confused on what they want to see as a future landscape, and that's one of the challenge I guess we have as a company. And for us, if you think of the concept of BlaBlaCar, it's all based on sharing. It's all based on increasing car occupancy. So whenever we present the model, I would say at a pretty high level of regulators or governments, they love it, because you solve traffic, you increase car occupancy, it's good for the environment. So it's more like when you trickle down at the city level, at the region level, that you find lots, it's very inconsistent. And suddenly you realize it's difficult to operate when at a much higher level they tell you it's fantastic and it's a good thing to do. So I think the challenge is how do we connect the dots between some level of political will at a high level to all the regulation, regional, city type, country by country type regulations.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. I mean, you're French-based, but you're, again, 22 countries.
Yep.
Which country have you seen the most regulatory or had the most pushback?
So I would say so far we had little pushback. So we need to do lots of explanation. So we've been, I would say we've been very polite as a company. So you have two approaches, and we chose like the polite approach, where we tend to go and talk to regulators and say, here's what we're going to do, and here's why it's a good thing. So far we had little pushback. We had a bit in Spain. So Spain, surprisingly, was maybe the country where we had to do like the more explanation about the model. We had little pushback in emerging markets like Brazil or Russia. So it's very interesting. So those are markets that are growing extremely fast for BlaBlaCar. So I would say so far so good. It's more about like writing the story together with regulators and explain why at the end of the day it's a good thing for consumers who want it. For the environment at the end of the day, but even for cities, right? You just like increasing car occupancy is something everyone wants.
Yeah, on that point actually, Sharon, I mean, can you share any findings from the OECD on how shared mobility can help cut back on, traffic, pollution, and all these things that,
Sure. We did a very interesting study a number of years ago, and actually we based it on the city of Lisbon. We took all the trips that were happening in the city and modeled them to see what the results would be if we put them on shared vehicles. And the results were really astonishing, and we got a lot of comments on that and coverage in the press on that, in that we found that it could completely reshape the city in terms of the congestion, in terms of the CO2 emissions, which is a huge question right now, minus 34% of CO2 emissions. Also in terms of parking, it would release a lot of space on the roads, on the streets, where currently there is a lot of parking. We estimated almost all of the parking and almost 80% of the underground parking could be changed to be used for something else, in fact.
Okay. Just one last question on this, and I want to talk about, Russia, Nicolas. But do you think that there's a gap between the way cities approach this, or is there a conflict between cities and their national governments? Vasco, do you want to take that one?
I think that at least in Portugal, the cities are taking the lead and moving in terms of reducing the impact of the environmental impact of traffic. Very clear, the Paris COP has put rules of decarbonizing the economy. Transport is one of the more important elements, and in that relation, obviously the state has a leading role, but the cities have been providing the support for that, because they are the first to be impacted. That has rise to opportunities for a player like Brisa.
Yeah.
We have been moving from being a toll collector to be now moving to an app. So moving from the car, as I said, to the people. We have also been launching share services for our clients. We are now we launched Drive Now, which is a car sharing operation. We are in a pilot for ride sharing, where we will be doing something similar to what BlaBlaCar is doing. We are thinking of our infrastructure in a way where for the urban areas, we are studying now the mobility hubs in the service areas where people can leave the cars and make the last miles integrated with other modes. And this is something that the cities are clearly supporting.
Yeah.
On top of this, as a user of technology and with a lot of know-how on the management of infrastructure, we are moving now to the international arena, selling our services in markets that are very important, such as the US, where we now have a significant program with the Illinois Transport Authority.
Okay. Actually, Sharon, just really quickly, I mean, can you expand a little bit just from your OECD view? Is there a disalignment between how cities and then their governments are on this, plan of removing congestion and traffic?
Yeah, I completely agree with Vasco, what he said in terms of what's happening in the cities. We see huge movement there in particular. And I think governments are realizing that with growing urbanization, we need to focus a lot on the cities. So I think that bridge is closing a little bit. And I'm also happy to say that we at the International Transport Forum are also looking at other cities based on what we've done with the Lisbon report. Our member governments have come to us and said, it would be interesting to look at this for other cities. So we've just finished a report on Lisbon, modelling at the city of Helsinki on Finland, also in Dublin, and we'll be finishing one soon on Auckland. But very important that we look at, as you mentioned, the Paris Agreement, that we look at not only what we can do in terms of renewables and technologies, but also what we can achieve with business models. I think that's very, very important. And it's something that we mustn't forget here. And I think here at the Web Summit, it's a perfect example of what's actually happening in the sector. We have seen a lot of transport startups here that can actually make a difference in the future. So my message would be to governments to actually take into account what's happening not just now, but what's about to happen right around the corner. Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting. Here's where I come back to the Russia point, that your your emerging markets are the ones that are surpassing, even your home market of France. I mean, I want to talk just 2 seconds about the U.S. market. Is it completely impenetrable given the distances, cheap gas, and Americans' obsessiveness with, cars? Is that something you'll ever crack?
Well, we haven't tried, right? So it's difficult to say if it works or doesn't work. It's true that the US is a bit different in the sense that, so maybe I should describe BlaBlaCar in 1 minute and then we'll go to the US market. But what we do is we allow drivers, right, to essentially optimize their car and offer the empty seats to passengers going the same way. But the way we've done that and the way we build the product is a driver is going to say, I'm leaving from that part of the city and I'm going to drive and drop you off in the other part of the city. And then you need 2 or 3 or 4 passengers to actually get their way into that driver and then from a drop-off location, go back home. And the issue is the first mile and last mile and public transport in the US is simply not good enough in most city pairs so that actually passengers can go to a car. So if you think of that in the Bay Area, if I drop you off in Sunnyvale and you want to go to Palo Alto, how do you go from Sunnyvale to Palo Alto? Whereas if I drop you off anywhere in Paris, anywhere in Berlin, anywhere in Lisbon, you take the subway, you take the tram, and it's very easy to connect. So cracking the first mile and last mile effectively was an issue in the US. And in fact, a company like Lyft, which is the competitor of Uber in the US, maybe less well known in Europe, but very well known in the US, started in fact as a company called Zimride. And Zimride was the BlaBlaCar of the US. Never took off. Guys were smart, they decided to pivot and do Lyft, and Lyft became a pretty successful company. So we're not really focusing on the US. What we've seen though in emerging markets, or however you want to call Russia or Brazil, we've seen that because the transport infrastructure in this country is pretty poor, right? So no trains in Brazil. In Russia it's okay, but it's not a fantastic transport infrastructure. Whereas if you look at like France, which is the home market, it has a pretty good transport infrastructure. Germany has a very good transport infrastructure. So we discovered, like launching these new countries, that the effect of shared carpooling or carpooling in these countries is actually even bigger than in Europe. So today we see more usage in Russia than we do in France after just a few years of operation. Brazil seems to be just like catching up on Russia, and we see like massive takeoff in those countries. So I think these countries are probably going to embrace shared mobility even faster than Europe, because there is more of a need actually, because they have not as good of an infrastructure. And I guess what I'm saying for transport, it's something we've seen in other, in things like payment. So you see that China is doing like, is kind of leapfrogging credit cards and debit cards for payment. They go straight to like mobile payment. Why? Because they skip like one generation of infrastructure. So it's kind of interesting for us to see that actually those markets have more appetite for what we do. And again, there is a strong appetite in Europe, but even a stronger appetite in those markets because they don't have the infrastructure we had time to build in Europe.
I mean, the thing is, you're starting to offer carpooling services on shorter commuter distances, if I understand correctly. I know that's been piloted, but can you just elaborate a little bit about what that plan means for your model, and at what point do regulators start saying, well, you know what, you guys are looking a lot like Uber?
Yeah, so it's a very good point, right? So we started, BlaBlaCar is known for what I would call long distance, right? So what you would typically do on a BlaBlaCar is a Paris to Brussels, Munich to Berlin. So it's like really city to city, or at least like village to village. What we wanted to do from the beginning is bring that model of like car sharing and really a C2C marketplace, and to bring that to commuting, right? So to bring that to, in France, those like 12 or 13 million people using their car every day to go to work. And that market is actually quite different from the Uber market, right? So it's not like a on-demand, press a button, get a car immediately to go somewhere. It's more like, again, like the millions or tens of millions of people commuting with their car every day that might never use a taxi, actually. And we want to bring the same sort of like peer-to-peer or C2C model and car-sharing model to short distance. And what we found is we need the product we built for BlaBlaCar, which is very much about booking a trip like a day or two in advance to do a long-distance journey. Doesn't exactly work for short distance. For short distance, meaning commuting. And we had to rethink the model a bit, so we launched a new product called BlaBlaLines that we're testing right now in Paris, and we start to have like tens of thousands of people actually using that and sharing their commute. And if you think of the impact of that long term, if we as successful on commuting as we were on long distance, you really change the way actually cities operate, because you increase car occupancy from today 1.2 in cities to today we have 2.8 on BlaBlaCar.
Unfortunately, we have time for about one more question. Can I just do a really quick round robin from each of you, and just to understand, what does modern transport look like from your eyes in 20 years? Sharon?
Well, I'd like to hope that when we move forward, bringing into mind what we want to achieve. And I think it's very, very important, we believe at the ITF and the International Transport Forum, for policymakers to discuss with all actors of the transport sector, including the private sector and the members of our corporate partnership board, how we can do that best. Because what we can see is there is a lot of potential out there, but if we don't do things in the right way, then we won't deliver on the policy goals that we need to deliver on.
10 seconds, Vasco.
Well, we have not discussed what the impact of autonomous driving can be. I think that it's going forward. I don't know if it's going to happen in 1 year or in 5, but it certainly will have a tremendous impact in the way transportation happens in the world. We are preparing our infrastructure, the communication between the car and the infrastructure. We have an advantage there. We have since the 90s. We have connected cars in our infrastructure. with Via Verde, and now we have 3 million cars that represent significantly more in terms of client potential.
Okay.
I'll try to be very quick. So
leave it there.
Just one quick fact, like
Yeah.
75% of mobility is done by car today. It won't change. In fact, it's probably going to increase. So I think the future is going to be autonomous, shared vehicles going point to point. And that's probably what's going to happen for the next like 5, 10, 20 years.
That's your vision. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Sure.
Thanks.